Hey guys, thanks for watching. I'm Brandon, and today we're going to be building a roof to go over this door. So let's get started. The first step was to measure and mark all my boards and then cut them to length at the miter saw. The plywood that I'm using for the top is a 1/2 inch thick, and I want it to inset inside of the frame. So I'm going to be cutting a 1/2 inch groove out of all the pieces. I set my table saw's blade height to 1/2 inch, as well as setting it 1/2 inch from the fence. And then I'll run both edges through the table saw, and that will leave me with a nice 1/2 inch groove on these side pieces. For the front and back pieces of the frame, I want to leave a little bit on each end and not have a notch. So I'm marking the front and back of the saw blade with some tape, and that'll let me know how far to cut on that board. I apply some tape to the board as well, and then do a drop cut at the back of the blade, and I'll stop my cut when I get to the tape on the front of the blade. Again, I do 2 sides this way. This leaves me with a cut that's almost all the way through except for the ends. I use a hammer and chisel to square up these ends and remove the rest of the material. The 2 center boards in the frame won't need a groove, but instead will need to be trimmed down so that the plywood will sit flush against them. So I raise the blade on my table saw and leave the fence setting the same depth, and then run the boards through. And as you can see, these boards sit perfectly flush with the side pieces. I cut a 20-degree angle on all of these pieces, and that'll be the pitch of the roof. And then I drilled pocket holes in the end that doesn't have the bevel. This is what will attach it to the front of the frame. I used some glue and 2.5 inch screws to fasten it to the face of the frame. I make sure that the groove stays aligned so that the plywood will sit flush when the frame's assembled. For the backside with the bevel, I just apply some wood glue and then put screws straight through that back board into the other pieces. This is going to be against the wall anyway, so you won't see the screws. Now that the frame's assembled, I measure for the plywood piece. And then I transfer the measurements to the plywood and cut it with the skill saw. Before I attach the plywood, I go ahead and mount the frame to the wall, making sure that it's level. This is easier, it's a lot lighter without the plywood, and it's easier to install the support brackets, which I'll be making next. I'm going to be using this old 4x4 I've had laying around for the support brackets. I'm just going to clean them up a little bit with the sander to make them look a little nicer and take off some of that weathering. Here's some seductive, intense eye contact sanding for you. Anyways, next I measure and mark the 4x4 in the length and as well as finding the center line in the width. This will give me a crosshair to align my saw to. I make the cut, making sure that my blade lines up exactly with that crosshair. This will give me 2 even pieces after I make my cut. Now I need to figure out the angle that has to be cut at the top. I'm sure I can do some complicated math, but I don't like math, so I just grab a piece of scrap plywood, cut it at the 45, and then hold it up and mark for the angle. I take it to the miter saw and slowly adjust to where it matches that angle, and then make my cut. I can then just place the piece onto the 4x4s and mark for the cuts. I'm actually going to notch these ends and not cut them through, so I'm setting the depth of my blade to a 2x4. With the blade the right depth, I just cut along these lines. I'm also going to make a series of cuts to remove some of this material. And I'll come back with a hammer and a chisel and clean it all up. I cut some small piece of 2x4 and attached them to the bottom of the brackets with some glue and some screws. This is what will go against the wall. I'm also pre-drilling some holes for the screws that will attach it to the wall. And all I need to do now is screw it in place. Now I could install the plywood, and it fit well in that groove, and I attached it with some screws. With the plywood in place, I cut some pieces of roofing felt and staple it to the roof. I was sure to cut it longer than needed and then use a utility knife to trim it down to the right size. For the actual roofing material, I've had these pieces of rusty tin laying around and I thought they would do well. First, I measure and mark for my cuts and try to avoid any bad places that are in the tin. I used a circular saw to cut the metal, but you definitely want to get you some gloves and safety glasses and earplugs before you get started. To cut the metal with the circular saw, I first removed my good blade and installed an old blade, but I made sure that the teeth were installed in the reverse direction of the saw. I made a cut line all the way across and then made sure that my tin was supported to where I'm only going to be cutting through the tin. I lay a board on top for my saw to ride on. That gives it a flat surface and it's much easier than trying to go over those humps and grooves that's in the tin. Making the cuts through the metal, you have to go pretty slow, otherwise the saw can bind. Once I have all my pieces cut to length, I lay them all out and measure the width. These 3 pieces of tin are actually going to be wider than my roof, so I want to cut the same amount off of each side. The last thing I do before installing the tin is use a wire brush to knock some of the rust off, and then I'll follow up with a sander to smooth it out even more. And then I attach the tin with some roofing screws. The last thing I do is use some 100% silicone and go over the screw heads, and there was a couple of holes that was already in this old tin, so I filled them in too.
The cover's all complete, just in time. It's actually supposed to rain over the next few days, so I'm glad I got that tin on there. I think it came out pretty well. Let me know what you think in the comments. Please like and subscribe, and thank you for watching.